Today we are going to discuss chlorofluorocarbons, which are also known as CFCs with reference to the environmental chemistry. Here we discuss what are these compounds and how they affect our environment and what has done regarding these compounds in future. Let's have a look at the introduction. Chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons are fully or partly halogenated hydrocarbons that contain carbon, hydrogen, chlorine and fluorine. So they are produced as volatile derivatives of methane, ethane and propane. As in simpler alkanes, carbon has tetrahedral symmetry. The fluorine and chlorine atom differ greatly in size and effective charge. The methane-derived chlorofluorocarbons deviate from perfect tetrahedral symmetry. So, the physical properties of chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons are tunable by change in number and identity of halogen atoms. In general, they are volatile, but they are less volatile than the parent alkanes from which they are formed. This decreased volatility is attributed to the molecular polarity induced by the halides, which induces intermolecular attractions or intermolecular forces. This was first manufactured in 1930s and industry soon found a wide variety of application for them due to their chemical unreactivity and heat absorbing properties. Chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons have no natural source. They were first manufactured in the 1930s and due to the inertness, industries found a broad spectrum application as refrigerant, degreasing agent and cleaning solvents. They invented it in 1928 and since then concentration of chlorofluorocarbon in the atmosphere have been rising. Due to the inert nature, they may remain in the atmosphere for 40 to 150 years. The most common representative of dichlorofluoromethane, which is also known as R12 or Freon 12, and its structure as shown in the figure. Now we are going to discuss the properties of chlorofluorocarbons and its subclass. Number 1. Chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons are inflammable. Number 2. Chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons are volatile but less than their parent alkanes. Volatile means the compound which evaporates at normal temperature. Number 3. Decreased volatility is attributed to the molecular polarity induced by the halide, which induces intermolecular interactions. Thus, methane boils at minus 161 degrees Celsius temperature, whereas the fluoromethanes boil between minus 51.7 to minus 128 degrees Celsius temperature. Number 4. Because of polarity, the chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons are useful solvents. Number 5. The densities of chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons are higher than their corresponding alkanes. In general, the density of these compounds correlates with the number of halides. Number 6. Chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons are usually produced by halogen exchange starting from chlorinated methanes and ethanes. As in the following reaction, the chlorofluoromethane was synthesized from the chloroform. Here is the application of chlorofluorocarbons, which is well represented by the picture also. Chlorofluorocarbons are largely used as refrigerant, solvent, degreasing agent in the electronic industry, blowing agent in plastic formation and propellant for aerosol kilns. Billions of kilograms of chlorodifluoromethane are produced annually as a precursor to tetrafluoroethylene, the monomer that is converted into teflon. And as you know that Teflon coated utensils are used worldwide, so you can well imagine how we are entangled between chlorofluoromethane and hydrochlorofluoromethane. Now, here is the most important aspect of the entire discussion, that is the discovery of environmental relationship of chlorofluorocarbons. Scientists initially believed that chlorofluorocarbons would be harmless in the Earth's atmosphere because of their chemical inertness. This inertness and their lack of solubility in water gives chlorofluorocarbons a long lifespan in the atmosphere, that is tens to hundreds of years, depending on the chlorofluorocarbon. In the late 1970s, scientists began to realize that chlorofluorocarbons do break down in the upper atmospheric region known as stratosphere and thus contribute to the depletion of the ozone layer. Stratospheric ozone shields life on Earth from the harmful effect of the ultraviolet radiation. The ultraviolet radiation induced breakdown release free and highly reactive chlorine and bromine atom from the chlorofluorocarbons. Several subsequent chemical reactions are kick-started by this process, including the breakdown of the stratospheric ozone layer. Even a small decrease in the stratospheric ozone concentration can result in an increased incidence of skin cancer in human beings and genetic damage in many organisms. In the following reaction, chlorofluorocarbon molecule dissociates in the presence of ultraviolet radiation into more reactive radical species with one or more unpaired electrons, and this reaction occurs in the stratosphere. The chlorine atom then reacts with ozone, initiating a process whereby a single chlorine atom can cause the conversion of thousands of ozone molecules to oxygen. Hence, ozone is depleted. Ozone depletion does not mean that a hole is created in the ozone. It means that the ozone gets thinner at any end from where ultraviolet radiation can easily damage life on Earth. Such conditions have repeatedly occurred over the Antarctic, causing the hole in the ozone layer. This picture represents the entire story from slide 8 to 10. In the picture, box 1 shows the emission of chlorofluorocarbons into the environment where they entered the ozone layer. Box 2 delineates what is going on in the ozone layer in the presence of sunlight having high intensity ultraviolet radiation. Box 3 shows the arrival of harmful radiation on Earth. Nowadays, chlorofluorocarbons are recognized as harmful chemicals because of their ozone depletion properties. This picture represents the entire story from slide 8 to 10. In the picture, box 1 shows the emission of chlorofluorocarbons into the environment where they entered the ozone layer. Box 2 delineates what is going on in the ozone layer in the presence of sunlight having high intensity ultraviolet radiation. Box 3 shows the arrival of harmful radiation on Earth. Nowadays, chlorofluorocarbons are recognized as harmful chemicals because of their ozone depletion properties. Slide 12 represents the short-term effects due to the depletion of ozone layer by chlorofluorocarbons. Inhalation of higher concentrations of chlorofluorocarbons can cause the symptoms of number 1, intoxication, number 2, reduced coordination, number 3, lightheadedness and headache, number 4, tremor and convulsion, number 5, irregular heartbeat, number 6, frostbite on the skin and in the upper airways. Now let's see the long-term health effects. Health effect due to the increased ultraviolet radiation. Ozone, while a minority constituent in Earth's atmosphere, is responsible for most of the absorption of ultraviolet radiation. The amount of ultraviolet radiation that penetrates through the ozone layer decreases exponentially with the slant path thickness and density of the layer. When stratospheric ozone levels decrease, high levels of ultraviolet radiation reach the Earth's surface. UV-driven phenolic formation in tree rings has dated the start of ozone depletion in northern latitude to the late 70s. In October 2008, the Ecuadorian Space Agency published a report called Hyperon. The study used ground instruments in Ecuador and the last 28 years data from 12 satellites of various countries and found that the ultraviolet radiation reaching equatorial latitudes was far greater than the expected. The report concluded that depleted ozone level around the mid-latitude of the planet are already endangering large population in these areas. Later, the CONIDA, the Peruvian Space Agency, published its own study which yielded almost the same finding as the Ecuadorian study. Epidemiological studies suggest an association between ocular cortical cataracts and ultraviolet exposure using crude approximation of exposure and various cataract assessment techniques. A detailed assessment of ocular exposure to ultraviolet radiation was carried out in a study on Chesapeake Bay watermen, where increases in average annual ocular exposure were associated with increasing risk of cortical opticity. In this highly exposed group of predominantly white males, the evidence linking cortical opticities to sunlight exposure was the strongest to date. Based on these results, ozone depletion is predicted to cause hundreds of thousands of additional cataract by 2050. Cataract is also shown in the beautiful eyes of this kid. Malignant melanoma, a form of skin cancer. Malignant melanoma is much less common but far more dangerous, being lethal in about 15 to 20% of the cases. One study showed that a 10% increase in ultraviolet radiation was associated with a 19% increase in melanomas for men and 16% increase in women. A study of people in Punta Arenas at the southern tip of the Chile showed a 56% increase in melanoma along with decreased ozone and increased ultraviolet radiation level. Increased tropospheric ozone. Increased surface level of ultraviolet radiation leads to increased tropospheric ozone. Ground level ozone is generally recognized to be a healthy risk, as ozone is toxic due to its strong oxidative properties. The risks are particularly high for young children, the elders, and those with asthma or other respiratory difficulties. At this time, production of vitamin D. Vitamin D is produced in the skin by ultraviolet light. Thus, high ultraviolet exposure raises human vitamin D. Recent research shows that many humans have less than optimal vitamin D levels. In particular, in the United States population, the lowest quarter of vitamin D, it means that they contain vitamin less than 17.8 nanogram per ml, were found using information from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey to be associated with an increase in all-cause mortality in the general population. While blood level of vitamin D in excess of 100 nanogram per ml appear to raise blood calcium excessively and to be associated with higher mortality. The body has mechanisms that prevent sunlight from producing vitamin D in excess of body's requirement. Effects on animals. A November 2011 report by scientists at the Institute of Zoology in London found that whales off the coast of California have shown a sharp rise in sun damage. And these scientists fear that the thinning ozone layer is to blame. The study photographed and took skin biopsies from over 150 whales in the Gulf of California and found widespread evidence of epidermal damage commonly associated with acute and severe sunburn, having cells that form when the DNA is damaged by the ultraviolet radiation. The findings suggest rise in ultraviolet radiation levels as a result of ozone depletion are to blame for the observed skin damage in the same way that human skin cancer rates have been on the increase in recent decades. Apart from whales, many other animals such as dogs, cats, sheep, pets, and terrestrial ecosystem also suffer the negative effects of increased ultraviolet radiation. Effects on plant life. Depletion of the ozone layer and allowing excess of ultraviolet radiation would initially be assumed to increase damage done to plant DNA. Reports have found that when plants are exposed to ultraviolet radiation similar to stratospheric ozone depletion, there was no significant change in plant height or leaf mass, but showed to respond in shoot biomass and leaf area in a small decrease. However, ultraviolet radiation has shown to decrease quantum yield of photosystem II. Ultraviolet damage only occurs under extreme exposure, and most plants also have ultraviolet absorbing flavonoids which allow them to acclimatize to the radiation present. Plants that have been affected by radiation throughout development are more affected by the inability to intercept light with a large leaf area than having photosynthetic system compromised. Damage from ultraviolet radiation is more likely to be significant on species interactions than on plants themselves. Now here is effects on crops. An increase of ultraviolet radiation would be expected to affect crops. A number of economically important species of plants, such as rice, depend on cyanobacteria residing on their roots for the retention of nitrogen. Cyanobacteria are sensitive to ultraviolet radiation and would be affected by its increase. Despite mechanisms to reduce or repair the effects of increased ultraviolet radiation, plants have a limited ability to adapt to increased levels of ultraviolet radiation. Therefore, plant growth can be directly affected by the ultraviolet radiation. In the 1990s, 93 nations agreed as a member of Montreal Protocol established in 1987 to eradicate the production of ozone-depleting chemicals by the end of the 20th century. Because of a growing concern over stratospheric ozone depletion, a ban was imposed on the use of chlorofluorocarbons in aerosol spray dispensers in the late 1970s by the United Nations, Canada, and the Scandinavian countries. By 1992, the list of the participating countries had grown to 140 and the timetable for ending production of chlorofluorocarbons advanced to 1996. This goal has largely been met. Hydrochlorofluorocarbons pose less of a risk than chlorofluorocarbons because they decompose more readily in the lower atmosphere. They also degrade the ozone layer and are scheduled to be phased out by 2030. At the end, just for the general knowledge, I want to explain the Scandinavian countries. These are Nordic countries, include Finland, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and the Faroe. These countries share similar flag, language, and many cultural traits. And Faroe Islands are autonomous country within the Kingdom of Denmark. Regulatory gap. While the production and consumption of chlorofluorocarbons are regulated under the Montreal Protocol, emissions from existing banks of chlorofluorocarbons are not regulated under the agreement. In 2002, there were an estimated 5,791 kilotons of chlorofluorocarbons in existing products such as refrigerators, air conditioners, aerosol cans, and others. Approximately one-third of these chlorofluorocarbons are projected to be emitted over the next decade if action is not taken, posing a threat to both the ozone layer and the climate. A proportion of these chlorofluorocarbons can be safely captured and destroyed. Regulation and DuPont. In 1978, the United States banned the use of chlorofluorocarbons such as freon in aerosol cans, the beginning of a long series of regulatory actions against their use. The critical DuPont manufacturing patent for freon were set to expire in 1979. In conjunction with other industrial peers, DuPont formed a lobbying group, the Alliance for Responsible CFC Policy, to combat regulations of ozone-depleting compounds. In 1986, DuPont, with a new patent in hand, reversed its previous stance and publicly condemned CFCs. DuPont representatives appeared before the Montreal Protocol urging that chlorofluorocarbons be banned worldwide and stated that their new HCFCs would meet the worldwide demand for refrigerants. EU legislation. EU legislation on ozone depleting substances is among the strictest and most advanced in the world. Through a series of regulations, the EU has not only implemented the Montreal Protocol but has often phased out dangerous substances faster than required. The current EU Ozone Regulation contains a number of measures to ensure a higher level of ambition. While the Montreal Protocol regulates the production of these substances and their trade in bulk, the Ozone Regulation prohibits their use in most cases. Moreover, it regulates not only substances in bulk but also those contained in products and equipment. The EU Ozone Regulation also sets licensing requirements for all exports and imports of ozone depleting substances and regulates and monitors not only substances covered by the Montreal Protocol but also some that are not covered, which means there are 5 additional chemicals called the new substances. Impact of global action and remaining challenges. Global consumption of ozone depleting substances has been reduced by some 98% since countries began taking actions under the Montreal Protocol. As a result, the atmospheric concentration of the most aggressive types of ozone depleting substances is falling and the ozone layer is showing the first sign of recovery. Nevertheless, the ozone layer is not expected to recover fully before the second half of the century. This is because once released, ozone depleting substances stay in the atmosphere for many years and continue to cause damage. Much remains to be done to ensure the continued recovery of the ozone layer and reduce the impact of ozone depleting substances on the Earth climate. Atmospheric model estimating ultraviolet radiation. The Environmental Protection Agency uses the atmospheric and health effect framework model to estimate ultraviolet induced health effects that may result from stratospheric ozone depletion. AHEF combines satellite ozone measurements with projected emission of ozone depleting substance, which means ODS, to estimate future ozone concentrations and associated changes in ultraviolet radiation and health effects. The AHEF is used to number 1. Estimate the change in health effects resulting from various ODS policy scenarios. Number 2. Perform sensitivity analysis. Number 3. Compare and evaluate results generated by similar model. Number 4. Examine the public health and atmospheric effects. Number 5. Aviation. Number 6. Methyl bromide use. Number 7. National ambient air quality standards. Number 8. Halon decommissioning strategies.